if you look at the Philippines, true enough, our strategic location is very important for superpowers, especially those who have ambitions and interests to control the Indo-Pacific region. And we're part of the island chain, the first island chain. So in a way, if you look at my country, it's being transformed. Its geographic location has been transformed. It's like the buffer of the external forces. But what is the risk for Filipinos and for the Philippines given this situation? First and foremost, if in any case there would be an escalation or a military escalation, may it be in the South China Sea or may it be in the Taiwan Strait, especially in the Taiwan Strait, between China and the United States, because this is really between the two superpowers. I mean, look at the Philippines. We're small. We have a lot of problems. Do you really think we have the capacity to fight with China in that sense? Of course not. So it's really between the United States and China. So if anything happens in the Taiwan Strait, the first casualty will be the Philippines.
Hello, and welcome to Global Majority for Peace podcast. I'm Ileana Chan. Every week on this podcast, we discuss with special guests from across the world our mission of building a global movement to promote peace and challenge the US-led war drive against China, Russia, and countries in the global south. We will be posting the first part here on YouTube and the full episode on Patreon for free. So please become a member. We're just trying to diversify our platforms just in case something happens to this channel. And also, if you are willing or able to give a donation, please know that it will go to covering our costs, and it'll be greatly appreciated. This week, we have a returning guest, Professor Anna Malindog Oy. She is a researcher, writer, academic consultant, and a regular columnist in the Manila Times. She's also a PhD candidate at the Institute of South-South Cooperation and Development, Peking University, Beijing, China, and a senior researcher of the South China Sea Probing Initiative, and a senior research fellow of the Global Governance Institution. So that's quite a huge mouthful. Thank you so much, Anna, for coming back onto Global Majority for Peace.
Thank you so much, Ileana, for welcoming me back. And I'm looking forward to our discussion. I think it will be very interesting and it will be very enlightening as well for the audience. And thank you so much.
Thank you. So it's been basically a year since you were last on this show. We've changed a little bit of the format. We now like to ask the first question to get the audience to know our guests a little bit more. We like to start with a little bit more of a personal note, which is how did you get to this particular worldview that you hold today?
Oh, thank you so much. I think it would be interesting as well to share a little of my background so that everyone knows why I have my point of view and, perspective on different issues that has something to do with my country, the Philippines, and even regional issues and global issues. I think as far as I'm concerned, since I was young, I was already very active politically speaking, even when I was in primary school and high school and even college. And I think one particular feature about me is more I'm a student activist when I was studying, and I'm a student leader since I was in primary school. So, I have this political views as young as primary school. And this kind of drive and energy was reinforced as I see, because I'm not just in school most of the time. When I was studying, even in college, I also was very active in community activity, community projects in our locality, in my own hometown, and even especially when I went to the University of the Philippines, Diliman, and I took my bachelor degree in political science. So I was very active on national issues. I was part of the social movement, and every now and then we discuss local, national, and even international issues. So I think my worldview and my perspective on different issues is a product of not only my education, but I think my exposure to the real world. Because after I study, and also on my side, I continuously study. I work, and study at the same time. And the things that I study is actually the kind of work that I do. So like, for example, when I was in the university, I study in my bachelor degree, but at the same time, as early as I was in the third year of my bachelor degree, I was already working with different non-government organizations in the Philippines and even outside of the country, and working on political issues like election reforms, even about World Trade Organization trade issues, and all of these things. And most of the time also I'm exposed to different, and I travel a lot within the country, the Philippines, and even outside of the country. And then after I graduate, I studied abroad. I lived in different countries. I think I've traveled almost across different continents as early as I was 20 years old. And I was already based outside of the Philippines since I was around 21 and working abroad. So that kind of exposure, not only to local issues of my country and even global issues, helped me in many ways understand how the world works. What are the realities that we are facing as individuals and even as my country is facing and even as part of the global community? And one thing also that is very much a good thing about me is I am not just a practitioner of anything that I study or research about or write about. I also had the experience of teaching in different universities in my country, and even abroad, I had the opportunity as well to train professionals in different issues like democracy. I had the training and I was on the ground. When I was based abroad, I was not working in, that you're just in the office and doing paperwork. Most of the time I was on the ground and dealing with people from different walks of life. So all of these things, if you put it together, I think it sums up why I have my worldview right now and why I'm still doing the things that I am doing since before. But one thing though that I can say, I like and I love what I'm doing. It's something that energizes me, and it's something that makes me motivated every day, because I think even in my own little ways, I tried to contribute to the discourse that's going on in the world right now, and even of course in my own country, the Philippines. So pretty much this is me. Professionally speaking, I would say.
Thank you so much. It's really interesting to have that background and that you started so young, which is,
Yes.
very laudable. But of course, now you're so prolific in so many different areas. One of the things that you have is a regular column in the Manila Times, but you have your own Substack, which we will link in the description below. So you also write for other outlets as well. But this recent article that I found of yours, The Hidden Costs of Manila's New Strategic Centrality, where you discuss the Diplomat's article by Michael Maza entitled, The World's Taiwan Strategy Runs Through the Philippines. On this podcast, Global Majority for Peace, we have discussed how the U.S. is eyeing a war with China by 2027, which we believe will be most likely through proxies in that area. The Philippines seems to be one of the main targets. If you agree with this assessment, can you help us break down indications of escalation that you're seeing?
Yeah, it's very interesting. Yes, I wrote a topic about this. This is a geopolitical issues, and I think it is unfolding at the moment. And you can see that the Philippines is now at the center stage of this geopolitical, I would say, situation, or sometimes it's a tension. So if you look at the Philippines right now, I would always say in my interviews that it's now being militarized into a forward operating base, first and foremost of the United States, plus external powers, which are definitely an ally of the United States. That's really what is happening. And you can see the manifestation of that through defense and security agreements that Manila under Marcos Jr. are entering too. And there's a lot of that. You have the expanded EDCA. Before EDCA, we had only EDCA bases or EDCA sites 5. And it's not necessarily upgraded, or in many ways, it's just there, and low key in some ways. But now you have an expanded EDCA, so you have 4 additional EDCA sites. But these EDCA sites are basically military installations of the United States. So we call them U.S. military bases, and this is spread across the Philippines. And the thing here is, it is not as if like it's just placed wherever. It is placed strategically across the Philippines. And the most strategic, I think, is in northern Luzon. And in northern Luzon, if you look at the Philippines, it has a close proximity to Taiwan. So in this sense, if you look at the Asia Pacific region, there are three flashpoints, but there are two flashpoints by which the Philippines is now being in the center stage, making it a forward operating base of the external forces, especially the United States, as I have said earlier. And how it's now going on, it's precisely because of this EDCA sites located very close to Taiwan Strait and also strategically close located to the South China Sea. For me, as far as I'm concerned, the South China Sea is a regional issue because there are other claimant states. But if you look at how Manila position itself, it is as if the only claimant state, that the only adversary or so-called the South China Sea is only between China and the Philippines, when in fact it is not. But Manila's approach to the South China is very belligerent and confrontational towards China. And the manifestation of that is because Manila at the moment thinks that it needs some kind of deterrence against China. So because of that, there's a lot of security and defense cooperation that it's trying to forge, not only with the United States, but with Australia, with South Korea, Japan, and even NATO member states, some NATO member states like France, UK, and all of this. If you look at the Philippines, true enough, our strategic location is very important for superpowers, especially those who have ambitions and interests to control the Indo-Pacific region. And we're part of the island chain, the first island chain. So in a way, if you look at my country, it's being transformed. Its geographic location has been transformed. It's like the buffer of the external forces. But what is the risk for Filipinos and for the Philippines given this situation? First and foremost, if in any case there would be an escalation or a military escalation, may it be in the South China Sea or may it be in the Taiwan Strait, especially in the Taiwan Strait, between China and the United States, because this is really between the two superpowers. I mean, look at the Philippines. We're small. We have a lot of problems. Do you really think we have the capacity to fight with China in that sense? Of course not. So it's really between the United States and China. So if anything happens in the Taiwan Strait, the first casualty will be the Philippines. And these EDCA sites definitely will be the target of retaliation coming from China. But of course, I know that China's doctrine, when you talk about military, they will not be the first to attack. They will have a second strike, but the first strike will not come from China. That's a very solid military kind of ideology or precept for the Chinese. But in any case, let us say the first strike come from the American side. May it be launched in my country because we have the EDCA sites. These are American bases. The retaliatory target will definitely be the Philippines and these EDCA sites. So what will happen to the Philippines? We will be in the middle of a possible or potential war that, the United States has been planning for so long. Actually, there was a prediction by 2027, 2028, all of this, but it's not happening. I'm glad. But if in any case, I hope not, something happened, like a military escalation, the first casualty will be us, the Philippines. So that is one thing. Now, on the other hand, what is the risk? Not only to the Philippines, which is being the target of retaliation, but when you talk about sovereignty, when you talk about our strategic autonomy, when you talk about ASEAN as a region, what is the risk to all of these things? First risk, something that our officials at the moment does not really understand, because the more you engage in defense and military pact, and even engagement like the reciprocal access agreement with Japan, the visiting forces with Australia, all of these things, the way they think it's deterrence, but actually it promotes more what you call strategic asymmetry. Because the more that our own strategic autonomy and independence and sovereignty are diluted or eroded in the long run. So that is something that many of our officials, actually, they don't understand that in the long run, we definitely will lose our strategic autonomy. And definitely, we don't have control over this, let us say, military bases that is now in our own soil, which is not ours. We don't have control over that. And if in any case an escalation happened in the Taiwan Strait, and even in the South China Sea, we don't have control in terms of how it will be shaped and everything. Because it's not our war. It's something that is not ours. We don't have any problem with China. And I don't see really the South China as a problem. But the way Manila is trying to explain this to the public is like it's a deterrence. But however, you can only have deterrence if you have what you call parity in terms of military strength with another country. But with China, I'm not kidding. We don't have that kind of parity. So far, none at all. So we're just relying on the so-called backing of the Western alliance led by the United States, which I don't even think is the right path forward. So this is the case. And when you talk about ASEAN region, the problem is other counterparts in ASEAN, countries like Malaysia, Singapore, Thailand, and even Vietnam, it promotes some kind of anxiety among other member states in ASEAN, precisely because as far as ASEAN member states is concerned, and as ASEAN as a bloc is concerned, it doesn't want to choose side. It doesn't want to choose side. They don't want to choose side, ASEAN counterparts. They want to maintain what you call, and they want to assert what you call ASEAN neutrality, that in all of these geopolitical issues, we're neutral. And they want to push with what the concept of ASEAN centrality, that when you talk about problems in the region, may it be geopolitical, may it be economic, ASEAN will be at the forefront in resolving and responding to this problem. And external forces should not necessarily intervene in how we're going to resolve our own problem in the region, because the Philippines is part of ASEAN. So this is the problem. It may complicate what you call ASEAN unity, because of course ASEAN member states would never want that the region will be like a battleground for superpower competition and rivalry. As much as I know, we don't want that. I talk to my ASEAN counterparts every now and then. Second, of course, the unity, because you have disagreement, will be diluted. And at the end of the day, the ASEAN neutrality will be challenged to a greater extent. So this is also the consequence. If Manila, I would say Manila, because it's really the Manila government under Marcos Jr. As far as I'm concerned, many Filipinos who are aware of these things, who are understand where we are at the moment, geopolitically speaking, don't agree with Manila's foreign policy. And this very much foreign policy leaning more to the United States and even prioritizing the proliferation of so many defense pact and so many security agreements that for us, actually, it's not what we need, because the country needs more economic impetus for our country to grow more and to be more competitive in the ASEAN region. Because to be frank with you, Ilyana, the Philippines is lagging behind its ASEAN neighbors, especially Vietnam and even Cambodia. I just went to Cambodia recently. Oh my God, I'm not kidding. The development is rapid. So if you're a Filipino looking at Cambodia, a very young country with rapid development and economics, less on politics, you will be very depressed. So this is the consequence of if Manila will pursue and will not be careful about its approach to certain issues like the Taiwan issue and even the South China Sea. And one thing that is very important, I think, that Manila should not forget, Taiwan issue is an internal affair of China, because Taiwan is part of China. As far as I'm concerned, let them resolve their own problem, because as a country, the Philippines has its own problems, and a lot of it. So better not interfere on this, and better not be used, the country's geography and the country, as a buffer, as a launching pad of external powers in their whatever kind of adventurism in the Taiwan Strait. Because I don't think in whatever sense the Philippines will benefit from it. I think the Philippines will be destroyed if in any case it will be a launch pad in any kind of military eventuality in the Taiwan Strait.
Yeah, it's a really good analysis. I often find myself curious and confused about how the general Filipino public is responding to a lot of this propaganda. Because, for one thing, like I've mentioned before, I have like a maybe more of a vested interest in the Philippines because I grew up going there. I have family there. My mom is from there. So it's a very real country to me. And sometimes the rhetoric from the West, they don't consider that the Philippines really being used as a pawn for the US is in such a precarious position. So sometimes they're a little bit flippant about, oh, you know, the Philippines is the next Ukraine. This is the fear, obviously. But I think I don't understand how the Filipinos themselves, like whether or not they are falling for this Western media propaganda. Because even in terms of framing the Philippines as a victim in the South China Sea, the West Philippine Sea, and all this sort of provocation, this language that is provocative, it just like when you actually break down, if you didn't know anything about geopolitics and you just break down what they're saying like China's using water
Mhm.
cannons, while the Philippines has 9 US military bases, as we've discussed, and Typhoon missiles, right? The
Yeah.
Typhoon, that is so much worse than water cannons. Like, even though, water cannons obviously can cause damage, but I'm just like, why is there still this belief that they're the victim in this scenario? Like, I guess my question is one, how, but also, is this anti China rhetoric and sentiment working on the general Filipino people?
To be very frank with you, sad to say, when you talk about China, there's this perspective and I think feeling of anti-China sentiment in the Philippines. That is very obvious and that is also very felt. But I would not say that the whole Philippines has this kind of sentiment or the all Filipinos they have this sentiments across the Philippines or even Filipinos abroad. I don't think so. I think there is a segment in the Philippines and some sectors in society that they have this anti-China sentiments very much vocal in different social media. And I think it most of this animosity or some kind of feeling of anti-China or anti-China sentiments to a greater extent is a product of twisted media coverage of South China Sea issue. And if you look at the Philippines, it's because supposedly, Eliana, the media should be responsible in explaining delicate and very complex issues like the South China Sea. But the problem in the Philippines, to be very frank, is not all media, like the mainstream media, is first, I don't think the reporters or those people who write about the news in South China Sea understand the complexity of the South China Sea issue. They cannot even have a distinction between sovereign rights and sovereignty, which is many Filipinos, when they read the media will project like we have sovereignty in the disputed area. When in fact, if you really study UNCLOS and even the 2016 arbitral award, there's no such thing. You have exclusive economic zone, which basically it's all about sovereign rights. But there's a big difference between sovereignty and sovereign rights and territorial waters and international waters. So this kind of subtopics that has something to do with the dispute in the South China Sea, I don't think all media practitioners writing about the South China Sea, they understand that. So when they write the news or whatever is happening in the South China Sea, Filipinos would read and it becomes like imprinted in their minds that we have sovereignty in that area and we own the area. So it seems like China is bullying us in our own territorial waters, when in fact that is not the truth. So there is a manipulation of narrative in the mainstream media. I'm not saying all reporters are like that, but most of them, because many of our mainstream media in the Philippines are co-opted by the Western media, especially by the Americans in many ways. So that is one big problem. And also the problem also with Filipinos sometimes is when they read the news or they watch the news on TV, they don't have this energy, or I think there is no habit to dig deeper. You need to dig deeper about the issue and try to be educated. I think with the kind of hard life that many Filipinos are going through at the moment, they don't have the time. Maybe they don't also have that level of education to understand very complex issue that has something to do with legal issues and many geopolitics and all that. So this is the second one. And the third one is it depends on the president as well. Because if the president stand and approach to the South China Sea issue is more confrontational and more assertive and probably belligerent, especially, let us say, towards China. So you expect that the government statements are also blurry and sometimes not necessarily accurate. And of course, the propaganda machine of the government also works to that effect, trying to weaponize the South China Sea issue against China and trying to, how do you call that, demonize China in the Philippines. So if you put this together, you would understand why there is such a thing as anti-China sentiments relatively high in terms of percentage in the country. But at this time, because probably of some people like myself who's trying to explain the issue in a way that is educational and for people to open their minds that this is a complex issue. You cannot have a black and white on this, and there's other claimant states. This is a regional issue. I think many Filipinos are already educated about the South China Sea. So in terms of that kind of anti-China sentiments, I don't think at this time dominates the public opinion or public discourse at this time. That one I can tell you. Of course, there are still other people who would criticize China, demonize China, but I think the wider middle class and even the intellectuals, to a certain extent, I can feel and I see it in my social media that they understand and they're now have this kind of level of understanding that this is a complex issue, that we cannot just demonize China and become anti-China precisely because of the South China Sea. And there is also the presence of American propaganda. And I think many Filipinos now understand that there are elements, American elements or pro-American elements in the Philippines who are trying to propagate such anti-China sentiment in the Philippines. And even the CIAs are very active in my country at the moment. So I think Filipinos are aware precisely because there are people who are trying to educate them through social media, especially Facebook and Twitter. So now there's a change in terms of public discourse. However, I would say that the anti-China sentiment is also reinforced precisely because if you look at the Marcos Jr. administration, look at the even our defense secretary, Marcos Jr. himself, and other elements in his government, they are parroting anti-China sentiments. And also, not only the South China Sea, there's also this dynamics that all Chinese who are in the country, who are visiting the Philippines, are spies doing espionage. So I'm like, so do you really think all Chinese who are in the Philippines doing tourism business and all that are spies? So what if the Filipinos who are in China also would be accused of the same thing? This is also happening. So it's in media and it's government officials who are, propagating this. So you would understand why the anti-China sentiment in the Philippines has that kind of traction. However, one thing also that you have to remember, the Philippines is a traditional ally of the United States. And at the same time, when it comes to affinity, I think the Filipinos are quite close to the United States and they idolize America or anything that is American, which is kind of a colonial mentality that I think the Filipinos has to unlearn. Precisely because if they really look at the United States, there's so many things that's not good about the United States. And I can tell you many things about it. And also Filipinos also, I think they forgot a certain part of our own history as a country, that even before the colonization time, even before the time of the Spaniards, the Philippines and China already have ties and already have that close affinity in terms of trade and even, relationship. And that part of our history, the pre-colonial history, is not necessarily highlighted even in school. And I think that is the challenge actually for Filipinos, for people like me, to educate our young generation that, before the colonizers came and colonized the Philippines, the China and the Philippines already have good relation and we already coexisted. And there's no problem with the South China Sea issue. Everyone in the region coexisted, prosper, and had good relations, especially when you talk about trade. And that part of history has to be revisited, I think, as one way also of trying to reflect of how to manage the conflict in the South China Sea. So this is pretty much Philippines at the moment when you talk about public discourse that has something to do with the South China Sea. But now I'm telling you, Iliana, it does not dominate the public discourse. Not too much. Not too
That's
much.
so interesting. That's so hopeful because the Tricontinental Research Institute, their dossier on hyperimperialism, it categorizes the Philippines as a de facto US military colony. That categorization makes sense. So when I see the Filipino people like internalizing this colonial mentality, it's so infuriating and it's so wrong. And I'm doing so much more work now on this podcast about how colonialism and imperialism purposefully underdevelops the countries that it seeks to control. And so pragmatically, the Philippines needs to develop. And in order to develop, it needs to get out of this shackles of US imperialism, and it needs to work with China. I mean, one of the things, though, that I think is interesting is that from our last episode with you, we talked about how the Philippines under the current president, Bongbong Marcos Jr., was threatening to leave ASEAN over the lack of support from ASEAN countries, as you've kind of alluded to, specifically about the South China Sea, because I think most countries in ASEAN can see the US puppet strings about that scenario. I think currently should be at the 47th ASEAN Summit right now in Kuala Lumpur, although by the time that we air this on Thursday, it would have already been gone and done. And he is going to be chairing ASEAN in 2026. So it's a formal handover from Malaysia to the Philippines. Now, can you give us an assessment of how you think he will seek to influence the ASEAN bloc's strategic decision? Because as you said, he's kind of an outlier in ASEAN in terms of his attitude towards China. And also, there's no indications that he will be sort of moving away from an alignment from the US right now, right? So what is your assessment of how this is going to shake down, in your opinion, in 2026?
Yeah, actually, it's still not our time to be the chair of ASEAN in 2026. It's just so happened that Myanmar cannot handle the chairmanship by 2026. So it was passed on the Philippines because it's alphabetical. So that's the reason why. So now in Kuala Lumpur, I think officially speaking, Bongbong Marcos and President Marcos Jr. already accepted the chairmanship in 2026 as passed on by Malaysian government or by the Malaysian chair. So now it's very interesting, to be frank with you. And almost everyone, my friends from different parts of the world at the moment, is asking me the same question. What do you think? Will Bongbong Marcos or Manila, how they gonna handle the chairmanship in 2026? What will be the priority? And the next question is how ASEAN-China relation would look like under a Philippine chairmanship under a presidency of Marcos Jr. So these are the questions that every now and then being asked to me in the last, 2 weeks? So that's what I'm asking. But and I think it's like this, no? I think it's very interesting, to be frank with you, that the Philippines will have the chairmanship in 2026 in an era where you can see that the strategic competition and rivalry between China and the United States, if you really look at it and assess, it's really intensifying, not just geopolitically speaking, but economically speaking. So the pressure for other countries, even ASEAN member state, is how to maintain neutrality in all of this, but at the same time to maintain good relation with both, because most countries, they need both. And I think as far as ASEAN member states are concerned, not necessarily the Philippines, but other, like, for example, Malaysia and the rest, and even Vietnam, Thailand, and all of these countries. And now we have an additional member. We have East Timor being part of the group. Yeah, officially accepted in this summit in KL. So from what I know, from my conversation with counterparts in ASEAN, ASEAN member states, as much as possible, wants to have a good relation with China, especially in the economic front, because most of them rely on China for investment in everything, infrastructure, the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative, and all of others, and even part of BRICS. Because you have Indonesia already, then you have Thailand and Malaysia would follow through in membership in BRICS. So they need China, economically speaking. But there are also realization from ASEAN member state, not just the Philippines, that in a way they need to maintain good relation with the United States precisely because of security and balancing. Because most countries in Southeast Asia, they have what you call hedging. They balance their relation. But at the end of the day, they want to be neutral. That's really pretty much the idea, except for the Philippines at the moment, which is very much close to the United States, not just economically, I think, but even geopolitically speaking and foreign policy wise, because our foreign policy, to a greater extent, sometimes we laugh about it as being dictated by Washington. It's not our foreign policy, but it's Washington foreign policy in every way. So now the most interesting question is, given this kind of context and scenario, how Marcos Jr. will navigate the chairmanship of the Philippines in 2026. Very interesting, not only for China, but for the rest of Southeast Asia and the world. The way I see it is, I think Manila will first and foremost prioritize or will highlight the issue on the maritime dispute in the South China Sea. That will be a center. The way I see it, potentially that will be the center stage of the ASEAN chairmanship of the Philippines, the South China Sea or the maritime dispute. Now, the question only is, what is the priority in this maritime dispute? I think Manila will be focusing more on the COC negotiation or the Code of Conduct negotiation. I think they will push for that because if you listen to Marcos Jr.'s statement before in relation to the South China Sea issue, in relation to ASEAN, he mentioned several times about the code of conduct, and he wants to have a binding code of conduct. And even before, he proposed that a code of conduct only among Southeast Asian countries, excluding China. But you cannot exclude China. China is the bigger player in here. So that's why I wrote an article about that, saying like you cannot exclude the other party. If you want a functional code of conduct, you need to have China in there. So for me, in the ASEAN chairmanship of Philippines, I think the center stage would be the maritime issue, more on the negotiation of the code of conduct in the South China Sea. And then that is something very interesting because we have to look and probably observe how the negotiation and how the statement will be crafted. Would it be very forthright, issue-based, and strong statement? Because, Manila, there's a possibility. I'm not saying it will happen. We will see. But maybe there's a possibility that Marcos Jr.'s government would want to elevate at a regional level the issue, its own stand and narrative when you talk about the South China Sea, regionally speaking. Because right now, if you look at it, it's between China and the Philippines. So you have this some kind of bilateral negotiation and exchange of narrative, which in many ways are very conflicting. And also it's a source of tension between the two countries. But when the Philippines become the chairman of ASEAN next year, there's a possibility that the Marcos government or Manila will elevate it at the regional level. So pushing for its national agenda and make it a regional agenda. Now, the interesting part is, would other countries in ASEAN agree to it? I don't think so, too. I don't think Malaysia would agree to it. I don't think Singapore or Vietnam. I think there will be debates on that issue. And the risk, if Marcos Jr. will push for this, is trying to regionalize the South China Sea issue agenda of the Philippines, is it will dilute what you call ASEAN unity, because definitely there will be disagreement among ASEAN member states. So that is a challenge for Manila, how it can calibrate its own agenda, its own national agenda that it wants to regionalize. At the other hand, how other countries in ASEAN will react to it. Because from what I know, I don't think Cambodia, Laos, and all of these countries would agree to a very strong statement against China, especially when you talk about communique. I don't think so. So that's one challenge for Manila. The other one, I think, is Marcos Jr. or Manila will try to compartmentalize. So maritime issue, and then you have the economic side. Because if you look at ASEAN, there's also the economic dimension. ASEAN right now is focused on regional integration, making it the center, and also regional integration in a sense that trade should be in intra-ASEAN trade should be deepened more. And so that is a priority of the Philippines, especially when you talk about issues of energy and issues of climate change, because we are experiencing a lot of climate change related issues and, typhoon and storm, all of these things. I think this will be prioritized also by the Manila. However, I think they will try to compartmentalize the two, the maritime and also this regional economic integration through different mechanisms like ACTA, like the ASEAN-China Free Trade Agreement, the RCEP, or the Regional Comprehensive Partnership Agreement among ASEAN plus China and others. So I think this will be the dynamics. But definitely, I'm not kidding, definitely Manila will push the center stage. And when you talk about security dynamics, that's where it will revolve. Now, the challenge on my side, if Marcos Jr. wants to have a productive chairmanship, of ASEAN. I think what he needs to do is to isolate the maritime issue of the South China Sea, even in the discussion of the Code of Conduct or negotiation in the Code of Conduct during its chairmanship, outside of the so-called great power competition among superpowers. It should be isolated. It should be discussed among ASEAN member states plus China, but outside of this rivalry between the United States and China. It can be done. And I think if Marcos Jr. will have the political will to do that, then the chairmanship of the Philippines of ASEAN in 2026 will be more productive and fruitful. And I think the ASEAN centrality, unity, and neutrality will be preserved, and there will be less disagreement among member states in ASEAN. However, the problem is, as you have said earlier, Liana, the Philippine foreign policy is leaning to the United States. Very much obvious that the United States has a hand on our side, not only on foreign policy, but even in other affairs of the country. I know it very well. So that is a challenge for us as a country, but it's something that we need to probably look forward to and observe and see in 2026. So many people are interested in this at the moment because many are on the edge. What Manila will do? Will Manila be able to preserve and pursue whatever kind of gains and productivity that the Malaysian chairmanship was able to achieve? Or would it deviate from there? Because if you look at the Indonesian chairmanship of ASEAN, it focused more on trying to push for ASEAN centrality. If you look at Malaysian chairmanship of ASEAN, it centers on economic unity and economic integration, less on geopolitics. Now, the challenge for the Philippine chairmanship in 2026 is to follow through with this too, the gains of the Indonesian chairmanship and the Malaysian chairmanship. Now, if it deviates, it means it would focus more on geopolitics, centering the South China Sea issue, which is, for me, would be unfortunate. I hope not.
Thank you for watching the first part of our interview. Please head over to patreon.com/Empire Watch to watch the full episode. The podcast is also available as an audio on Spotify and Amazon Music every Saturday.